Good afternoon. Welcome to episode 73 of UnCommonCents. A little bit of Doctor Who or something there at the start to get us started, Fraser. Welcome as my guest, Fraser Jack from the Cyber Collective. Today, we're doing a little bit of a case study, Fraser, just in terms of the Absolute Wealth Advisors business, which obviously I'm close to and a shareholder in, talking about our journey with you in terms of going through your, let's call it cyber boot camp, in terms of learning what we need to do and how we have to do it, and then talk about some of the steps that we had to go through together, then some of the work that I had to do after going through the course with you, because like all education, just the textbook doesn't cut it. We have to actually do something with it. And then all the lessons and things we discovered along the way about our environment and why that's important to test your environment and to go through this exercise. So good afternoon. In 30 seconds or less, tell us who you are for those that don't know.
Thank you, Dean. Yes, it's been an absolute pleasure hanging with you on workshops. Look, my name's Fraser Jack. I was an advisor for 13, 14 years, sold my practice, worked in licensing, got the hang of all the different stuff in licensing that you need to know about, then worked in advice technology in the tech space, and all of those three things combined basically led me into this where I am now, which is around making sure we can help advice firms and licensees stay safe with their technology.
Spectacular. And so the two things that we participated in, and we'll jump into the detail, is that we do Fraser's online course or education on a per user basis. So that's about keeping everyone cyber aware, as what I would call, in terms of just staying match fit in terms of things that might come up for us. So we all of our staff go through that constantly. And then the second part of what we did as part of coming on board is we did this cyber audit, Fraser. And so we're just going to go through at a high level all the things that all of the steps that we did and what it felt like at the time. And then a couple of the things that we noticed along the way that required us to do a reasonable amount of homework and also surprised us, I suppose, along the way. So I'll lead us through the journey and then we'll pick up a couple of things along the way. But the first thing, obviously, we had to get set in place was essentially the framework, first and foremost, Fraser. So that's somewhat of the rule book. So take us through a little bit about why it's important that you have that documented, and then we want to bring that to life. So what's the point of the document if it just sits on the shelf all the time?
Yeah, exactly right. And so if I think about from the big picture of what we were trying to achieve, and there are these global cybersecurity frameworks, there is the regulators within Australia, they've got guidance and they're all based on these frameworks. And so, when a client comes into an advice office, you kind of had these big picture structures of, a process that you go through and all this sort of big picture idea. They walk into your business and they go, oh, I've got the super fund. And so often it's exactly the same with advice practice. They, I've got this, password manager that we use, or I've got this thing, right? There are all these little products, right? They're essentially products. And we go, no, we start with this big picture structure where we do a needs analysis and we look at where you're at, and then we come up with some strategies, and those strategies result in products. And it's very similar in the cyberspace. So we go, there's these big global frameworks. Let's start there. Let's start with where the expectations of the regulators. Let's not start with the products. And then from there, we look at plans. And then of those plans, there's mitigation strategies. And then those strategies are, you should be looking after this, that, and the other. Therefore, we need a password manager. It does still lead to the description to that area. But in the medical terms, it's like, prescription before diagnosis is malpractice, right? So let's not start with the prescription. Let's start with that sort of thing. So, and you mentioned the audit before, and we're often saying to people, before you do an audit, you should put a whole lot of stuff in place. And then when you do the audit, it's going to come out pretty well. My business partner, Damien, says it's not about the audit. It's about when you have your first incident, and then you've got to demonstrate, not for the audit, but you've got to be able to then back it up and say, hey, we've been doing all these things for years. So it's about starting with that big picture concept. And so the first part of our process was certainly to say, across the different areas of a framework, which is before, during, and after an incident, you need to make sure that you've got boxes ticked in the compliance boxes. You've got boxes, you've done your people, ticked all the boxes for our people, and ticked all the boxes in technology, because we want to kind of highlight early on that it's not just about technology, that
Mm.
95% of incidents are actually human-based incidents. Like the human being was the one that was to blame, not necessarily the product.
Absolutely. And we'll probably touch on a few of the examples of how we got through. So we ended up with this plan. And the first phase of the plan, Fraser, was we actually had to go through and do a little bit of research on some of the things that we had. And the way in which you thought about this is in that risk context, is that how can people get access to the company data is the way that I would simply explain it. And so what we went through there is we actually went through all the ways in which the internet is connected to our data at the end of the day. So how were all of our staff connecting to the internet? And so that was a great exercise just to understand that we have 20 staff. They work all around the world essentially. And so all of those 20 people like using the internet, like they're connecting using their own private internet or not using cafe internet, but theoretically it's a possibility. So everyone's connecting to the internet. And so that's our first level of vulnerability about how everyone's connecting to the internet, what routers they were using and things like that. And the really basic and basic things about what passwords that people were using to access the router, because that was the first level of protection in terms of getting us out there. And then on top of that, we sort of did this exercise, which I'd love you to talk about, Fraser, about the DNS website and email, this second iteration of going, this is your digital footprint externally on DNS, email, and website. Most people listening only really know what the last two things are. So what was that in terms of that second protection wall? What's important that we think about there?
Yeah, so the concept in amongst that, and you're probably going to cover a million different topics because there's so many under cyber, the umbrella. But look, when it comes to that domain name, your business name.com.au or your business name.au or .com or what, and often we have a few variations of that name or the .coms, and we might end up registering a whole lot of different domains. Every single time that you register one of those, you're purchasing a piece of real estate on the internet. And that piece of real estate essentially comes with a billboard, we call a website. It comes with a mailbox, we call email, and it comes with an area where somebody could enter a piece of property, right? So you're going to try and put a fence around the property, make sure the letterbox has got locks on it, and make sure that the billboard has also got security on it. So it's really just going into those things, saying when you register that, you're responsible for what happens on that piece of real estate. And so we need to make sure that nobody can come onto your piece of property and start pretending to be you or behaving in a way that's inappropriate for a financial services business. And therefore, you end up being responsible for what happens on that domain.
And so what people should take away from that is that if we leave the keys or the back door open, people can actually send emails from your domain name. So someone could make up an email address called dean.holmes.1 at Absolute Wealth Advisors and actually send emails out to the community. And it looks like it's coming from my domain name, which is obviously a risk, because that's one of the things that we're all meant to check is where the email is coming from a domain name perspective, which is obviously an issue, Fraser.
Yeah, and I always say that you think about it as that there's a mailbox on that piece of property. All of the mail that you send and receive gets channeled through that mailbox. And so there's a copy that's kind of like the source of truth. That mailbox that's on that domain is where all of your emails actually come into and leave from.
Yep.
And so then, we think they're sending from our computer. They're not. Our computer is sending it to there, and then that's sending from there onwards. And so when we store, emails, there's behavioral stuff around how you store emails, because they all sit in that domain for a long time. And there's also a lot of sets of rules and instructions and settings inside of that domain that say, hey, if somebody is trying to spoof email me and sending emails on that are, theoretically coming from us that aren't, what are the sets of rules and instructions that the internet needs to know? And how does the internet know when it's not actually me? So
Yep.
yeah,
and so this is something that you probably can't do on your own for most of us in terms of our focus. And so it's actually make sure we've got a relationship with our IT providers to be holding them account to making sure that they're ticking these boxes. And so the real example there, Fraser, is that over the years, I'm sure all of us have this situation with our IT company where we don't ask the right questions and then something happens, or we do ask the question and the response is always, yeah, we can do that. And my response is obviously, well, why didn't we do it? And unfortunately, it ends up being, well, you didn't ask. And so part of this framework got us to ask the right questions, Fraser, to make sure that we were starting to put these brick walls in place in terms of our security for the internet overall, emails and website, etc.
Yeah, and I always sort of try and make sure that it's that demonstration of understanding piece, right? I always try to make sure you've got these things set. Excellent, tick. That's one tick. Do you know why you do that? And that's the second tick, right? So as a director of a business or as the collector or the responsible entity for that, collecting that personal data from clients, it's kind of up to you to kind of know, not necessarily how to do all the settings, but what that thing is, why it works, why it's important, and that you've got it. So, it's great that you've got it. Excellent. But do you know what these things are? And can you have a constructive conversation with your IT person? Because so often these IT people go, great, do you want the $30 one or the $20 one? You go, what's the difference? I don't know. The $20 one maybe sounds good, and you're making decisions without really knowing what these things do.
Absolutely. So that was a good lesson and learning for us from that perspective. The next things that happened through that data capture is we ticked off that we had a password manager. And so the things we had to tick off in that context, Fraser, is that we had a password manager, which was great. We use it, which is obviously important as well. And then the third question that you asked us is, what was our score? Because lots of these password managers give a score, and that score is to the uniqueness of the password. And so that score for us wasn't as good as what it should be, is a very political way of saying it. And we needed to raise it. And so the reality there is that we were using the password manager, but some of the passwords were the same across providers. Why is that bad?
Yeah, long, strong, and unique are always the words when it comes to passwords. And one is you don't want passwords being shared, right? Because you don't know who was in there and who got in and all those sorts of things when you look at audit logs. And so if you can get as many unique passwords as you can, that's great. A lot of those password managers, and we always encourage the concept of the friendly competition between teammates, where when you're able to pull up scores and have a team meeting and go, hey, Dean, you're first or second, and somebody else is lower down the rank, and you can play carrot and stick or any particular game around who's got to buy the coffees and who's shouting the donuts, to encourage those people to, in a gamification way, to improve password scores. So that's great.
Yep. Indeed. So that was a good lesson for us. We then, keeping on this data capture process, we then had to understand all of the software vendors. So what was the software that we have that we use day to day internally? And then what were all the providers that we use externally or partner with? Because there's an exercise of going through to understand who and what we're working with in that regard, and then what their cyber requirements are or cybersecurity policies are. And so an example to think about for everyone, pretty relevant in terms of how we might work with third parties, such as remote staff that may happen to work in another country or in Australia, but just remote from the head office, and or a power planner, external power planner. And so both of those, Fraser, represent interesting risks from a cybersecurity perspective. What do we have to be? What's the risk? What do we need to be thinking about when we've got that maybe that contractor relationship?
Yeah, and again, cybersecurity is just risk assessment after risk assessment. And so what we're thinking about here is, if everyone's got an approved product list for their investment options, right? So it's like we've done our research, our due diligence, and this particular product is on our approved product list. We're just trying to emulate that for the software tools you use and the outsourcing staff that you use, and so all the services that you use, for example, and to be able to say, yes, we've put them through the hoops, we've double checked, we know that this is a good level of security, and we can trust putting our client or sharing our client data with people, or these tools. So it's really just a matter of being able to demonstrate you did. There is a stack of guidance all the way through all of the regulators that talk about third-party supply chain and making sure that it's not just your business that you're looking after. When your client data is given to you, you're the custodian of it. And as you're then using other services with this client data, it's about making sure that those services are also giving that client the respect that they deserve by looking after their data and having their own services in place. And then So then your business point of view, having the compliance documentation in place to say that you have checked and you've done these things. And if you were a large organization or corporate organization, the very first thing that would happen is all these security questions get asked.
Mm.
And if that passes the security test, you're allowed to then go and look at the benefits and features of the product or the person and say, hey, we want to use them or we don't. So, but in small business, often that little step is just missed. And so it's about coming back and saying, hey, we actually need to make sure we've got that documented.
Yeah, absolutely. And the case study or the real idea is going, well, where is the copy of my client data? So this idea that the client has given you their date of birth, for example, and you call them diamonds or gold or something.
Yes, I do.
In that regard. And so, and then say you contract that external paraplanner, it's really thinking about, well, how did I give the external paraplanner that data? And is now there 2 copies of the data? Did I email it? And that might mean there's 3. Did I email the data across to the paraplanner? So now it's on my paraplanner's computer system, which I have no control over. It's in sent emails of it on my computer. It's in deleted emails of the advisor's computer, plus out there in the internet, as an example of going, well, how many times has this one piece of information been shared amongst parties? And so it's a case study of where, whenever you're dealing with third parties, being really clear about where the data is going to sit. And so if we use these external paraplanners, but yet we're just still using the old system of emailing them the paraplanning request form with all the source documents, we've now got 2 copies of that data. And the cybersecurity of now the paraplanner is actually equally as important as your own, because all the data's over there. Yep. Same with your remote staff that might work overseas, for example. Where is actually the data when you start working with them? Are we using one Dropbox or something like that to sync files? And so every time you update a file on your Australian computer, it's actually syncing with the computer over in the Philippines, as an example. And then there's a second data copy over there at that point in time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You're right. I call them diamonds because I think the lifetime value of a client is that of a diamond. Yep. And if you lose their data, you're basically losing. It's a bit like losing their diamonds, right? And so you've got to make sure that you treat it as such. And if you are physically looking after somebody's diamonds, then it's a lot easier for us to think about how to keep it safe and secure than it is this weird thing of the data in the cloud and us not really understanding it. So yep. You're absolutely right. There's data in transit and there's data at rest. Data at rest on a drive somewhere in your computer, and data in transit, going from one place to another. And so we've got to think about those things and making sure, as you said, that and when somebody's finished with that data, do they still have a copy? Is it at rest on their computer? Has it, make sure that you're tidying up.
Absolutely. So the one thing we're getting ready for, Fraser, as well through this process is the concept of a cyber drill. Now, I can't talk about when it's actually going to be to give away to the rest of the team, but what's a cyber drill for you? What's important? Why would we bother doing it?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's one of those things that behaviorally, and logically, you can write plans, you can have policies, you can do these things, and it's paperwork, right? It sits in words, it sits in somewhere, and somebody might have read it and then they understand 15% of it and they quickly forget about it. But when you go through that process of running through an actual simulation of something, whether it be first aid training, you might have to do your first aid certificate, whether it be a fire drill where you actually have to get up from your desk and walk down the stairs or outside and go and gather, these sorts of things become part of muscle memory. And once you've been through one or two, they become a learning experience that you have gone through when you are not at full peak stress or adrenaline pumping through your veins. Because if something happens in your business like that and you haven't trained for it or prepared for it, then you start to freak out. The fight, flight, or freeze mechanism kicks in, adrenaline's pumping, and you can't really make good rational decisions. And cybersecurity is a bit like a fire in the business where every second or every minute of every day counts, and the longer you wait or freak out or don't do anything for is a problem. So it's one of those things that requires somebody to make decisions and to act. And so we want to make sure that people are then have that muscle memory of training in before that happens.
Absolutely. And we'll put something on the screen in a second about Fraser's response map. But the interesting thing that we've had to go through, Anthony and I, in preparing for this event is we realized that the moment you do the drill, you don't have access to all of the stuff that you've just been building for the last 7 weeks with Fraser. And so what I mean by that is that we're all working in the cloud, we're all working on our cyber plans in SharePoint, and then the cyber drill turns off SharePoint. And so this element of making sure that we've got all of this information somewhere else, break glass in an emergency kind of concept. So it's on the wall, like a fire emergency, and making sure that we've got the emergency contact details of everyone as well, because theoretically we may not have the way in which we need to contact everyone through that process as well. And so getting our heads around the communication protocols and the actual steps without having it all written down elsewhere is an interesting part of it. We lose the tool that we thought we would be able to use at that particular couple of things about what's important in your 12R framework of incident response.
Well, I have to point out the fact that I'm most proud of the fact that every single word here starts with an R, except for the word plan. But certainly, I think like there's a lot of different stages, and to be able to move through a process map like this allows you to go, oh, great, there's more stuff to come, or where we're at in an incident. And step one obviously is recognizing, and step two is reacting, and they can be some of the hardest steps, believe it or not. Because people just go, oh no, and denial kicks in different stages of grief where they're angry or they're upset and they're annoyed. And then they get to that point where they start responding and ringing around and calling in the troops and making sure everyone knows what to do, etc. One of the things that I really think is important, and we talk about rules and it comes back to behaviors as well, is that a cyber incident is a really stressful time for everybody. There's often somebody to blame, and it can be a really stressful time, and there's a lot of finger pointing as to and that's not helpful. None of that actually helps get or solve the problem. So there's a whole lot of rational things that need to take place, and there's no space or room for emotional behaviors. And so having something like this written down in a plan to follow allows people to then, hang on, we've got some steps to follow. We've got to follow these steps. I kind of like relate this back to the Dr. ABCD and on the wall of a swimming pool or something like that. Every swimming pool in Australia has to have a process map like this on the wall as to how do you resuscitate in the event of an emergency. And this is kind of like you said, in the event of an emergency, what to do. And one of probably the other thing here is that relations or that public relations type communication stuff that can get missed as well, in knowing exactly what you want to say to who and how. As you mentioned earlier, ringing is really important, that you've got the phone numbers written down and on the page that's printed out. You've got a hard copy so that you can actually phone those numbers if you don't have them available, and knowing, for example, what your insurance policy number is and those sorts of things as well. Because if they're all on your computer, as you said, and they're locked and you can't get into it, then you don't know the number.
Yep,
What to say.
absolutely. And so I'd love to talk about that relations part, just in terms of we have a lot of stakeholders in our world that we deal with. And so there's telling the licensee, there's telling the government agencies, and then there's telling your suppliers, but most importantly, there's telling your clients as well. And you don't want to make this up on the fly. You don't want to make up your client communication at the point in time when you're very stressed going through this 12 step process. What's your thoughts on how you might follow through in terms of that client communication?
And it's a really good part of the cyber drill to work out who's going to say what, because not only do you want to know what you're going to say, but you want it to be consistent across your 20 team members. Because if they're all answering phones from clients that are ringing up there to say, hey, we've just got the message to say you've been hacked, what are they all going to say? And are they all going to say different things? They're going to be at different levels of emotion, as I mentioned before. But you want them to stick to the script and to say what you want to say. Rule number one of media training is say what you know, not don't just say what don't say what you know, say what you're supposed to say type thing. So stick to the script. And so you really want your team to stick to the script, but also telling your team is one thing too, because that can be, what are you going to tell your team? What are they going to tell the clients? What do you need to say? And you're right, there is a lot of other stakeholders around, like licensees or suppliers or shareholders or other people, and definitely reporting. The way that the current legislation set up, that reporting is essential. Everybody wants to know. There's different regulators like the Australian Cybersecurity Centre that looks after wanting to know if there's ransoms being paid, and there's the Privacy Act that wants to know. That obviously ASIC with licensing wants to know as well. So there's a lot of people to make sure that everyone's on the same page.
Yep, brilliant. And the last one, the recovery plan, somewhat is that I back up my data all the time, Fraser. But your question to us was, well, have you tested it? That whole story around we need to be backing up our data, and whether it's in the cloud or in our SharePoint, the great story that you tell about Microsoft is not really a backup.
Yeah. There's a lot of assumptions made around backups,
Mm,
and so it's really just pulling on those assumptions and going, do you know that for sure? Is that exactly what happens? I do like to use the analogy of things are in the Microsoft world. That's excellent. Good on you. Fantastic. There's redundancies across that Microsoft environment around their many different areas where they keep that information. But if somebody gets into, it's a bit like I describe Microsoft like it's you're an office, you're in an office building, and you're a tenant of their building, right? And so you've got an office. They give you a space and you fit it out with all of your furniture, and they give you all the facilities and the sprinklers and the lifts and the bathrooms, and all the facilities come with it, no problem at all. And you fit out your own office. But if you let somebody into your office and they ransack it or burn it out,
yep.
Microsoft will easily give you a new office up in a different part of the building, but it's up to you to then refit it with all of your data. And so when I say that, I mean, people have, inadvertently given away their Microsoft password, and next thing somebody's signed in as them, and then they're managing to do things, and they're managing then to get in and remove or delete or do things inside of their Microsoft environment. This is especially true for anything that we consider to be insider threat, where a disgruntled employee starts removing or deleting stuff, right? And so that then deletes across all of the zones, and so it doesn't help. So having those backups of your Microsoft thing is really important, because if you get a new tenancy, you need to be able to restore the office as it was.
Yeah, brilliant. It's a great example of, we trust in these external service providers to always be 99.99% uptime, for example, but sometimes we forget about, well, what if these deleting scenarios happen, disgruntled employees or hackers as the categories that ruin that 99% uptime, or they still hit the numbers, but it's not perfect for your particular business.
Yeah.
And so the last thing, Fraser, that I love to talk about is just the importance of employee training on the awareness of cybersecurity threats that might be coming through. As financial planning firms, we have almost the most data of professionals in relation to clients' financial and health and estate positions. And so therefore, we are a reasonably good target for hackers in terms of getting the information. And our frontline staff are the ones that have obviously caused the access through errors. So what are we doing to train the staff from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think of this in a couple of different ways. Obviously, as the profession's evolved, we've done CPD for so long, right? It's all about professional development, and that is half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour worth of information at one time. And that's great for learning something, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you need to learn something, but it's not great for behaviors and habits, as
Yep.
in only 10 to 15% of that type of education learning builds on habits and behaviors. The way that habits and behaviors are formed, which is what we want, great cybersecurity habits, is through repetition. And so, what should I be doing? Here is an instruction. Don't do that. Do this. And that continued. So when you learn to put a seatbelt on when you were a kid, you didn't just get told once, you got told 100 times every time you got in the car, and it became this repetition. And these days you don't even think about it. And if you've ever trained kids to try and put a seatbelt on, you will realize that they don't do it the second and third and fourth time. And so that's just human behavior, right? So just because you know something doesn't mean you actually do it. We know that we probably shouldn't drink as much as we do, but yet we do. We know that if we ate better food, we'd be more healthy, but we still eat junk food, right? You know what I mean? Like, just because we know doesn't mean we do. And so if you want to make sure your team, and by the way, it's your entire team, not just your ARs, which we're so used to training in CPD land, where it's like, oh, the ARs need to learn this. But what about the rest of the team? We've got at least another double that number of team members that are dealing with our client data every day that we
Yep,
need to make
absolutely.
sure that they're the ones. And so, and I also joke about a little bit about the fact that the most dangerous team members are the new person that hasn't been trained yet and the CEO that thinks that they don't have to follow
Yeah.
the rules. Uh, and and funnily enough, we can all relate to that a little bit.
Mm,
Can't we?
yep,
And so, yeah, it's about ongoing education. It's about making sure that we are nudging regular nudges, and the regularity is almost more important than the actual skill. So
yep.
often we talk about awareness training, and you would have done the awareness training, and you go, "Oh, that's not teaching me anything really. I kind of knew that would be, or that's logical, or all those types of things." But it's not even about that. It's about showing up, once a fortnight for 5 minutes and then going. And that regularity is almost more important than the content and the subject matter itself.
Yeah, so for us, this was a big thing because we do have a lot of fingers on a lot of keyboards, and so the reality is that most the the staff in the business are doing a lot of the work in terms of talking, communicating with clients and product providers, and receiving a lot of the emails in terms of communication. And so we need to bring everyone's standard up in that regard. So that's been a great lesson for us in terms of teaching everyone, and then doing part of the training program is also doing those emails, Fraser, just to check people's understanding. So for those that don't know, it's essentially sending out a fake email or a fake
Yeah.
hacking email.
Phishing campaign. Yeah.
So it's a phishing campaign, so that we're able to see if anyone is getting caught on our versions of it, and then do some extra training off the back of that, and that's pretty powerful as
Yes.
well.
So it's being able to say that you do the staff training and phishing campaigns, but also be able to report on it, because it's just as important to be able to prove those sorts of things. And so, there's a stat that 95% of problems start with human beings, and
Yep.
yet we spend 95% of our budgets generally on technology and
Mm.
nothing on the humans. And so it just kind of, from a logical point of view, you go, well, it doesn't make sense, does it? And so, making sure that you're doing that training. And as ASIC put it recently in their court case with FIG, that mandatory staff training is what they're calling it these
Yep.
days. So whilst the direction's been there from ASIC since 2017, as of 2025 they've started referring to it as mandatory
Yep.
team training. Yeah.
Understood. So, Fraser, last thing, anything that you tell lots of advice practices that you haven't yet told me or our listeners? What's your last piece of advice?
I think I have one question for you too that I wanted to ask you, but
Sure.
I would certainly say that you've got to start somewhere and do something. It can be big and overwhelming, right? Because it's a big chunk of it. And you and I spent, as part of our workshops, 8 1-hour sessions together, right? So there's a lot of stuff to get through.
And I reckon there's 2 hours of work after each one.
Yeah, and so,
Yep.
and it's not just about you got to step your way through it, and you've got to start somewhere and get momentum and keep going and keep going and keep going, because there is a fair bit to get through. But I don't want people to think it's going to be overwhelming, because that would then freak them out. But I guess my question to you, Dean, was, you've known me for a long time, and this for a long time, and it was more recent that we went through the process.
Mm.
You would have thought before then, and I don't want to put anything into your words into your mouth, but where were you before then? Like, before we did this course, there's probably reasons and justifications in your mind as to, we're okay, we're at a place, I'm happy, I don't need to go and do this course or anything. And then how did you go after? What were your
Yeah, the reason I probably thought we were doing reasonably well. But I was in the category of DIY in that context, i.e., that I was someone that I'll say that I thought that I was ahead of the game in terms of the knowledge that I personally had in and around cybersecurity. That I thought, therefore, that the things that I had put in place, and we're all connected with band-aids in the context of what we've done. The things that I put in place were enough for the business. And what I realized in the conversations that we had before we started is that we were getting to a size, I suppose, but also the number of events that were happening were increasing as well. And so there was just too many moving parts that we needed to get a framework around what we were doing. So lots of the things that we highlighted through the process, it's like, yeah, I've got that. But what I didn't have is the proof that I had that to you. And that was the accountability element. It's going, I get that you back up, Dean, but how can you prove that you've backed up? What's the details of the provider? What's the frequency of it? Have you tested it? And so that's the testing and accountability part of it. And so we had there would be 30 examples whereby got some of it, but it needed to be built into that framework in order for us to reflect and go, okay, now we have a cyber policy as opposed to just cyber things that are going on in our world. So I've had multi-factor authentication for ages, but then you go, well, that's only one part of the puzzle. And so I think that that's the reflection and the answer to the question. It's building the structure around all the things that we may have done. And also the other thing is, frankly, as you get larger in scale, the ability for you to keep your fingers on the pulse of all the things that's going on is just impossible. And so the number of hours per week that this business works is just infinitely larger than what it was 5 years ago. And that's also, therefore, the risks are higher because there's just more people around. And so it's not, I don't want to mean that is, you've got to get to a certain number of humans in order to do this, but it just, the scale of the problems became too big that, I needed to put the framework around it.
Yep. And you were happy with the process?
I loved it. So in the context of the process is that we did those weekly events for 8 weeks. We had to go away and do the homework. So that was the homework part. I still have some homework left as part of the process, but I think that that's essential, and it makes sense, as you said at the start, is why do a cybersecurity audit at the start when you're not match fit? Like, just do the work over the 8 weeks period and then do the cybersecurity audit, because at least then you've actually put some things in place whereby if you do the audit at the start, they're just going to tell you things that would have been obvious if you started to follow the framework and the process of putting these things into place. And so I think that that's a first thing. And the second reflection as well, from a licensee perspective, this is a top-down kind of thing, but the large licensees are now mandating these type of audits and activities across their firms. And some of the listeners will be within small licensees, and so there's a resource thing there that they may not have got up to this section just yet, but like the large licensees are definitely implementing cybersecurity policies for all their advice firms with specific targets that they have to hit in terms of Essential 8 and Microsoft scores, for example. The smaller licensees will follow suit, and the self-licensed or individual licensed firms, there's no one else really coming and saying you need to do these things in the same way. But every AFSL has exactly the same legal obligations regardless of the number of ARs, and a single AR has the same probability as our firm regardless of licensees. And so it's really important that all practices or all AFSLs start to think about this, Fraser.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree. And even with a small business with one client, you kind of, once you've got one client and you're collecting one person's data, you then get into that zone of what you need to have in place. And
absolutely, yeah, you're there anyway. So yeah. Absolutely. So thank you for the question, and obviously going through the process with us as well. How do people jump on and do the course? What's the linkage to that, and how should they find you?
Yeah, we've got on our website, the Cyber Collective, thecybercollective.com.au. There's a get an instant quote page where people can say, hey, we've got this many employees, and they'll, they don't have to talk to anybody. They can see the price. And so it's all transparent there on the website. Yep. And then if they want to join, they can certainly join follow that bouncing ball through that process, join, and we rerun the workshops. We start them, we do 12 a year. So that starts every month. And so when people, can see when the next workshop's going to be starting, we run workshops in groups. So they become peer groups, and sort of people help each other along, and we run them in a confidential space. So we don't record them. People can speak freely, be vulnerable, and, work with their peers, and everybody, everyone that comes on has got stuff that they can work on. So there's no such thing as everybody coming and going on, we're amazing and you're not, Yep. There's none of that. Everybody's got stuff to learn and grow, and we all grow together. So it's great.
Excellent. Thank you, Fraser. In a couple of weeks' time, I'm having another UnCommonCents episode around cyber insurance. So maybe that's exciting, maybe it's not, but everyone's got to have it. We're going to go through the terms and conditions of a couple of policies, talk about what you can claim, how you have to go about claiming. And so for anyone that's interested, watch the UnCommonCents page for when that one's coming out. But I think that these two things obviously go hand in hand. And so we'd hate to be paying for a cyber insurance policy that doesn't pay out because we didn't do certain things. So we need to link those two. So I'll definitely let you know, Fraser, when you can watch that one.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dean.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Cheers.